Just a quick sound check. Good evening, everyone. Let me start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to tonight's online seminar, which will be delivered by Dr. Georgios Niarchos on the topic of the Tamrash rebellion, attempts at Pomak Autonomy. Now, let me go through some housekeeping items before we venture into tonight's seminar. October will be an absolutely monster month for the Greek community of Melbourne, with two massive festivals on the schedule. Firstly, the Greek Film Festival. After a 2-year absence, it returns. It commences on Thursday, the 13th of October, with the film Iftihia. Tickets are on sale at the moment. We'll also distribute the link as well during the course of the presentation. This will then be followed by the Antipodes Street Festival on the weekend of the 22nd to the 3rd of October. This is the same street festival that's normally held in February, March. So within the space of 5-6 months, there'll be 2 street festivals. As I said, a huge month for the Greek community of Melbourne in October. Let me thank the sponsor of tonight's seminar, Jenny Promos, and invite you all to become sponsors of the seminar of your choice. It's only a tax-deductible $100 donation. Furthermore, let me remind you that next week's seminar is also online only. It will be in Greek, and it's one not to be missed. It's a seminar for those who are interested on how a future Greek diasporic identity will look like in a generation's time. It will be delivered by Professor Georgios Anagnostou, who's a professor of modern Greek language and culture at a higher state university. The title being Diaspora's Cultural Future, Greek America, Public Memory, and Making Identity. Basically, it's a case study of Greek America and what does the future hold? How will this multifaceted diasporic identity evolve? And just a reminder for those that will have any questions during our Q&A interval, simply submit them to the chat or comment section on Facebook or YouTube. Now let's return to tonight's seminar, which considers a very little known incident in Balkan history, the Tamrash rebellion, which has been interpreted as an attempt at Pomak autonomy. And who are the Pomaks? Very simplistically, the Pomaks today are usually considered descendants of native Orthodox Bulgarians and Paulicians, adherents of St. Paul, who converted to Islam during Ottoman rule of the Balkans. They've lived traditionally in the Rhodope Mountains, which straddle the Greek administrative region of Thrace or Thrace and southern Bulgaria. Nowadays, there's also a Pomak diaspora, mainly residing in Turkey and other parts of the world. So it's an ethno-confessional minority. The Slavic language is considered related to some of the Eastern Bulgarian dialects. The mass turn to Islam in the central Rhodope Mountains happened between the 16th and 17th century. And with time, their confessional identity became their dominant mark. In one of those obscure incidents of history, the Pomaks formed what was a short-lived governing administrative structure in the Tamrash region of the Rhodope Mountains, which became known as the Tamrash Republic. It existed from 1878 to 1886. How this came about, what was the build-up, what were the intrigues around it, is what tonight's storyline is all about. And to deliver this presentation, we have with us, all the way from Athens, Greek-Turkish relations, minorities, modern Greek history, and Balkan history. He's been involved in multiple research projects and has published widely in space, including a co-authored book, The Last Ottomans, the Muslim Minority of Greece, 1940 to 1949, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2011, but has also been translated in both Greek and Turkish. Dr. Niarchos studied theology at the University of Athens and holds an MA in Eastern European Studies from the University of Bradford, while his PhD was completed at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His doctoral thesis is entitled Between Ethnicity, Religion and Politics, Foreign Policy and the Treatment of Minorities in Greece and Turkey, 1923 to 1974. Shows that he has quite a good grasp and quite a good handle on minority issues and relations in Greece. Yorgo, I pass the baton on to you.
Thank you very much. Hoping that you can all hear me well. Uh, Good evening or good morning, as far as I'm concerned, from Daphne, Athens. First of all, I would like to thank Kostas Avlonitis for the technical support and the detailed and precise information that he provided in the course of the preparation for the present talk. I also owe a big thanks to you, Nick, for inviting me today. It is a pleasure and a privilege to take part in this series of seminars of the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria, which has welcomed such an impressive diversity of topics and variety of scholars. This is often hard to find in Greek studies departments, not to mention respective diaspora activities. So kudos to Nick for that. Last but not least, I would like to express my deepest appreciation to everyone in the audience for taking their time to be with us today. I hope you enjoyed it. With respect to the present talk, I would like to begin with some acknowledgements. Research work can be a lone job, but sometimes it's teamwork. The initial inspiration about this topic, rather the first time I came across Tamrash, was whilst working in a research project at the London School of Economics about the history of the Muslim minority in Western Thrace in the 40s. This project was with my dearest colleagues and friends, Professors Kevin Featherstone, Dimitris Papadimitriou, and Dr. Argyris Mamarelis. It was a marginal incident in our wider research at the time, and we did not get very deep into it, but it has some intriguing elements that stayed in my mind for future reference. Some years later, though, I was able to revisit Tamrash in the context of another research project. Today's presentation is based on archival research that was conducted some time ago with two dear colleagues and mainly friends of mine. These are Dr. Vasilis Koutsoukas, a very talented historian and geographer with a very good knowledge of the history of Thrace. Vasilis currently works in secondary education at Moraitis School of Athens. And also Vemont Ourbake, who is assistant professor at the Department of Political Studies at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Vemont is one of those rare cases of foreign academics who work in Greece. To say that he's a polyglot does not really do justice to him, and he's internationally a top expert on minorities in the Balkans. But most of all, he's a unique character. Hence, today, actually, you get three for the price of one, which is not a bad bargain, I guess. Of course, for what you are about to hear today, credit should be shared with both of them, but needless to say, any liability should fall on my shoulders alone. Let me also do a short introduction on the Pomaks before getting into the main dish. The Pomaks constitute an ethnic group with a complex and disputed history than most ethnic groups even in the Balkans. The historiography on the Pomaks questions who they are, if they are an autochthonous or immigrant group, whether their conversion to Islam was voluntary or forced, and this happened around the 17th century, and whether they should be considered as ethnically Bulgarian, Turkish, Greek, or something else. In any event, during various periods, the Pomak community appeared to have had a greater sense of their own separateness, shaped by the Muslim religion and Bulgarian language. Their geographical isolations would have been relevant in this regard, as they are scattered in mountainous and remote settlements of the Rhodope mountain range, along both sides of the borders between Bulgaria and Greece. Overall, the outlook of this ethnic group was deeply entrenched in the Islamic tradition and the social order of the Ottoman Empire, with which the majority of the Pomaks felt a strong affinity. The predominance of patriarchal structures and a strong reliance on family networks and religious institutions provided for a conservative and rather insular form of social organization, particularly in the small rural communities where the vast majority of Pomaks lived. In economic terms, the Pomak community has been far poorer than the lowland Muslim and mainly Turkish population. Their main economic activity revolved around forestry, small-scale animal breeding, and subsistence agriculture. Given their geographical isolation, contacts between the Pomaks and other local communities were infrequent, particularly since most commercial transactions between the highlands and the lowlands were conducted by the Vlachs and Sarakachans. In this context, the cultural specificities of their community had persisted for centuries and remained largely unaffected by the demographic turmoil of the early 20th century. A central feature of this culture was a strong attachment to the land and Islamic tradition, with the Pomak community supplying a significant body of religious personnel across the region. The cultural distinctiveness of the Pomak community would have also been supported by overwhelming levels of village endogamy. though in subsequent decades, internal migration towards more urban areas and increased numbers of mixed marriages with lowland Turks radically altered the meaning of Pomakness. Let's now talk about the historical context and the Eastern crisis of the time. Well, the protracted decline of the Ottoman Empire brought the wider region of Thrace to the forefront of Copernican nationalist narratives. And when we're talking about the wider region of Thrace, we're talking about the Ottoman vilayet of Edirne, which encompassed eastern and western Thrace and Eastern Rumelia. This was indeed a process mirroring developments in many other parts of the Balkan Peninsula, which entered a new round of unrest and conflict in 1875 with the revolt in Bosnia and Herzegovina against Ottoman rule. This event was a source of major concern, especially for Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which feared the creation of a large Slav state bordering Dalmatia and Croatia, and thus toyed with the idea of annexing the region. The great powers began mediating in order to achieve a settlement that would satisfy all sides and the fighting. In the meantime, in April 1875, a new uprising erupted in the Ottoman province of Rumelia, this time by the Bulgarians. This is better known as the April Uprising and culminated with the infamous Bulgarian horrors, or Bulgarian atrocities, as they became known. The Bulgarian uprising was badly organized and ended in disaster. Since the Ottoman army was preoccupied in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Sublime Porte assigned the suppression of the Bulgarian rebellion to Ottoman irregulars, which we know as Basibozuks, who were mainly drawn from Bulgarian Muslims as well as Circassian refugees from Russia. These Ottoman irregulars committed widespread atrocities and massacres against the Bulgarian population, often against women and children. Around 60 towns and villages were burned to the ground, with most notable the case of the Batak massacre. We'll come to this at a later stage. Whilst estimates about the dead vary between 12,000 to 30,000, always depending on the source. The suppression of the April Uprising caused indignation around Europe, with the public opinion protesting about the Bulgarian horrors and atrocities. One of the most famous reactions of the time came from the liberal British politician William Gladstone, with his book on the Bulgarian horrors and the question of the East. The publication of this anti-Ottoman libel was an open challenge to Disraeli's pro-Ottoman policy, thus creating a stir. For almost 2 years, thousands of books, and I mean really thousands, of books, booklets, leaflets, newspaper articles, and political debates representing both sides of the British political spectrum shook the British public opinion and alerted it to the new developments that were taking place in an already troublesome region. In parallel to the events in Bulgaria, Serbia and Montenegro declared war to the Ottoman Empire, aiming to get independence and territorial gains, producing a wave of support among the Russian public opinion. This is a time of Pan-Slavism, and those uprisings were seen as the opportunity of Russia to dominate the Balkans through the creation of Slavic vassal states. However, the Ottomans succeeded in defeating the insurgents on all fronts and seemed to restore their authority in the region. Russia, who also acted as an instigator to the crisis, was not happy with this prospect and declared war to the Ottoman Empire in April 1877. Let me share some maps showing those events and the development of the Russo-Turkish War. The war ended with an impressive victory of the Russian army, which in March 1878 imposed to the defeated Ottoman Empire the Treaty of San Stefano, which among other terms provided for the independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, as well as the creation of Greater Bulgaria. The treaty came as a shock to the rest of the European powers, Britain in particular, which managed to reshuffle the cards at the Congress of Berlin in August 1878. According to the new arrangement, Macedonia returned to the Ottoman Empire, whilst Bulgaria was divided into principalities, with the northern part remaining autonomous and the southern one, Eastern Rumelia, semi-autonomous. Let's see another map showing the development and the changes of the treaties of San Stefano and Berlin. The whole green area, obviously, is the area that was it was awarded to Bulgaria after San Stefano. Those one with the dotted lines is the demarcation of the borders after Berlin. Nevertheless, this new territorial arrangement caused dissatisfaction among the Muslim, mainly Pomak population of the mountainous areas of Rhodope. Although the villages of the region were not greatly affected by the events of the Russo-Turkish War, they became witness to the retreat of the defeated Ottoman army of Suleiman Pasha, the latter being cut off by the Russians, who were at Adrianople/Edirne, had to opt for the difficult way of crossing the Rhodopes in order to retreat into Ottoman soil. Thousands of Muslim refugees came along with the Ottoman troops, seeking refuge in safer areas, often plundering the Pomak villages in order to survive. The situation caused waves of panic to the local Pomaks, many of whom also fled from fear of the Russians and the Bulgarians. On the 31st of January 1878, the armistice agreed at Edirne fixed the line of demarcation at the watershed between the rivers Maritsa, known as Evros, Mesta, which is Nestos in Greek, and Arda. The San Stefano Treaty confirmed that borderline, which was unacceptable for the Pomak villages of the Rhodopes, that now faced the prospect of their incorporation into Bulgaria. On the other hand, the situation remained undefined, as the whole area of the Rhodopes appeared to serve as a buffer zone, since it was not occupied by any army. Let's see two more maps that will show us exactly this area. This line, the big line in the center, is Eastern Rumelia, and you may see the two shaded areas in the south, which is the area on the right is the area of Kerjali, and on the left is Tamrash. And here we will have a closer look. I don't know how you can see how clearly it is. On the north of Tamrash, it's Plovdiv, Philippopolis, and on the left is Tatar Pazarjik. And on the right, where we have Kerjali, the biggest city on the north is Khaskov, or Khaskoy, as it's also known in Turkish. As a result of this new developing status quo, a number of Pomak villages took arms in order to protect their independence. The insurgency was initially confined to the area south of Plovdiv and Tatar Pazarjik. This is the area we see in the map, but was later extended towards the Rhodopes and the Arda Valley. According to British sources at the time, for example, the Vice Consul Calvert in Philippopolis to Layard, the British ambassador in Constantinople, on the 18th of April of 1878, this is the time of the letter, fights between Pomaks and Bulgarians took place in the Kritsna Valley between Philippopolis and Tatar Pazarjik. It is unknown who had the initiative, but it provoked the engagement of the Russian army in the region, which captured and destroyed Pomak villages. As a result, mountaineers from all around the area appear to have taken arms to defend their homes. The House of Commons archives hold several letters of delegates representing those Muslim communities that are addressed towards British authorities pleading for protection from Russian cruelty. On the other hand, the Provisional Governor General of Eastern Rumelia, Arkadis Stolypin, denounced any accusation against the Russian army, claiming that for the condition of the refugees from the Rhodopes, the blame falls on the heads of ruthless agitators and aggressors, who under the leadership of the British officer Sir Clair, have forced those refugees to take arms and prevent them from returning to their homes. A small note here, Arkadis Stolypin, who was a military commander of artillery, was the father of Pyotr Stolypin, who later became one of the most known prime ministers of Russia, before he was assassinated in 1911. Pyotr Stolypin is considered to be a reformer, and if he was led to perform his reforms, some say that maybe the October Revolution would not have taken place. According to Vice Consul Calvert, in a letter to Lord Salisbury, I quote here, as regards the Rhodope Mountains, it is very difficult to obtain reliable information of the progress of events. No intelligence reaches this from the other side, nor do the Russians allow access to the lines from here. Moreover, such news as transpires from Russian sources on this and other subjects is singularly uncertain and contradictory, end of quote. In the meantime, with British encouragement, the Ottoman government dispatched a special commission in the area, in order to appease the Pomaks and convince them to abstain from acts of aggression that would provoke a more widespread and full-scale intervention by the Russian army in the region. If you remember, we said that the area was not occupied by any army and acted as a buffer zone. So the Ottomans had an interest in not provoking the Russian army. In a letter of Clair to the Marquis of Salisbury, that's in early June 1878, he writes, Lord Salisbury was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Sami Pasha and Wasai Fedi, who were sent by the Porte to endeavor to prevail upon the Pomaks to the districts of Mount Rhodope to lay down their arms, have returned to Constantinople, having entirely failed in their mission. The Muslims who are resisting the invasion of their country and their extermination by the Russians and Bulgarians would not listen to reason. They told the Turkish commissioners that they had not wantonly commenced the struggle in which they were engaged. Their brethren, they said, had given up their arms to the Russians on the assurance that they should be treated with justice and that their lives, property, and honor should be respected. The Russians had thereupon armed the Bulgarians with these arms and had encouraged them to fall upon the Mohammedans, whom they massacred, whose wives and daughters they outraged, and whose property and villages they destroyed. The justice which had been promised was denied them. When they complained to the Russian authorities, they were insulted and handed back to the Bulgarians. Whole villages had been destroyed and their inhabitants exterminated or compelled to fly for their lives, abandoning all they possessed. The Muslim population, having the limited choice left to them of being either murdered in cold blood by the Bulgarians or shot down in hot blood by the Russians, have preferred the latter alternative. End of quote. 20 days later, in another letter, the British ambassador to the Marquis of Salisbury mentions, and I quote here again, "Judging from the information which has reached me from various sources, it is, I presume, certain that the provinces to the south of the Balkans will not form part of the proposed Bulgarian principality, but will remain under the direct sovereignty of the Sultan. Such being the case, I would venture to suggest to your lordship that an attempt might be made to induce the Russians to refrain from attacking the Muslims who are now in arms on the Rhodope Mountains. They have been termed insurgents, but the name is unjustly and wrongfully applied to them. They have not risen against their own government, nor against any lawfully constituted authority. They are only defending their property, the honor of their women, and their lives. They have no wish to descend into the plains to attack the Russians and Bulgarians. They simply seek to preserve themselves from the shocking treatment that has been inflicted upon the Muslim inhabitants of the Low Country, who have been massacred in large numbers, whose wives and daughters have been outraged, and whose villages have been ruthlessly destroyed." End of quote. And we must note here that it was the infamous Bulgarian Capitan Petko Voivoda, who had actually undertaken the task to suppress the activities of Pomak armed units in the area. As early as July 1878, the British ambassador to Constantinople maintained that the insurgents had declared themselves an autonomous Pomak nation under the leadership of British-born Stanislas Graham Bauer St. Clair, also known under the number Hidayet Pasha. The insurgency was initially concentrated to the Eastern Rhodopes, but at times it extended until Niarchos and Tamrash, which became the center of the insurgency at a later stage. The precise role of St. Clair in this rebellion remains a topic of considerable uncertainty. St. Clair was born in today's Lithuania. His father was a British military officer who had served in India in the Imperial British Army, and his mother was a noblewoman of Polish descent. In this context, Stanislas St. Clair had resented the Russian aggression against Poland. It had rendered the matter into a personal vendetta, loathing anything Russian. As a son of a military officer, St. Clair served in the British Army, taking part in the Crimean War, but later settled in an estate by the Black Sea in today's Bulgaria. Initially, he worked in the British consulate in Burgas. In 1864, he became a British consul in Varna. In parallel, he began adopting the name Hidayet Pasha. His dislike for the Russians extended to the Bulgarians, and he wrote, actually he co-authored, the book A Residence in Bulgaria, Notes on the Resources and Administration of Turkey, which book praises Ottoman rule and is highly critical against the Bulgarians. St. Clair also took an active role in the British debate on the Bulgarian horrors, authoring the book Bulgarian Horrors and Mr. Gladstone's Eastern Policy, that's in 1876, where he tries to deconstruct Gladstone's knowledge of Turkey and the Turkish people and lists a number of reasons explaining why Reyas are still Reyas. In this context, he claims that, and I quote from the book, while Mr. Gladstone's supporter, the labouring man of England, can hardly afford to get drunk on Saturday nights, that is to say, 52 times a year, the Bulgarian is not sober and can afford to be not sober for at least 183 days per annum. The working man of England has but his hands as his only capital, and Mr. Gladstone does not furnish him with land, pasture ground, and forest to destroy, which the Sultan gives to his Reya, the Bulgar. To carry the comparison further, we see the working man of England locked up if he dares to get drunk or violate law. He can neither kick his wife nor rebel against the crown without being either imprisoned or hanged for doing so. Now the Bulgarian can, thanks to the Sultan's leniency, never cease to get drunk the whole year round, kick his wife, and is allowed to rebel 3 times before he is punished for his misdeeds. Now I say, as charity begins at home, before Mr. Gladstone attempts to force the port into granting autonomy to Bulgarians, why does he not coerce Her Majesty into granting 182 days free drunkenness at government expense and impunity for all crimes to King Maud? End of quote. Concluding his remarks, St. Clair provides a table of statistics where Bulgaria is inhabited, according to St. Clair, by 639,000 so-called Bulgarians compared to 634,000 non-Bulgarians. Thus, according to him, and I quote, considering that a Turk is worth either as a laborer or a soldier 5 Bulgarians, it would be difficult to constitute a Bulgaria out of such elements. In short, Bulgarian is no geographical fact at all. Is it a moral fact? A nationality fit to govern itself? It is not. Bulgaria has neither a nobility nor a gentry, nor any Semitic class. Its notables are usurers, its clergy, the only real oppressors of the poor. So when war broke out between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, St. Clair left the British military and enlisted in the Ottoman army, where he reached the rank of general, serving under Suleiman Pasha. After the latter's defeats in Sofia and Plovdiv, the Turkish army fled through the mountainous and hard to reach parts of the Rhodopes in order to seek a safe haven in southern areas and eventually Istanbul. St. Clair arrived in Kerjali, and from there he embarked on a mission to inspire and reinforce the spirit of resistance to the Pomak villages of the region, often toying with their fear that the Bulgarians would take revenge for the suppression of the April uprising, where the Pomaks had an active role. Several British, Spanish, Hungarian, and Polish adventurers participated in his insurgency. Some sources maintain that St. Clair was supported by the Ottoman and the British government as a countervailing influence to the advance of the Russian Empire towards the Aegean. However, the British ambassador to Constantinople, Layard, gives a different perspective. In a letter to London in late July 1878, it's addressed to Marquis of Salisbury. Layard says, "My lord, the state of affairs," I quote, "the state of affairs in Mount Rhodope and the adjoining districts not occupied by the Russians may end in causing serious embarrassment to the port. As your lordship is aware, a certain Mr. St. Clair has placed himself at the head of the Mussulmans who have risen in arms to protect themselves against the Russians and Bulgarians. He seems to possess and exercise military and civil authority. He signs himself in letters which he has addressed to myself and others, Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Pomak Nation. I understand that he collects the titles and raises the taxes and has established a kind of civil government. He has with him several Polish and Hungarian adventurers, whom I am told he leads the Pomaks to believe are Englishmen of rank. A short time ago, when an English gentleman with whom I am acquainted and who has warned me of what is taking place, went into the Rhodope district to obtain information as to the position of affairs in it, he was announced by Mr. St. Clair to his followers as a great English Pasha, who had been sent to him on an important diplomatic mission. My informant had some difficulty in extricating himself from the awkward position in which he found himself placed. In this manner, the Pomaks and the Mussulmans from the plains who have joined them have been led to believe that they have the support of England, and has induced them to place themselves under the protection of the British government. As autonomy is now the order of the day, they have declared themselves to be an autonomous Pomak nation. They consider that they have as much right to autonomy as their neighbors. Mr. Sinclair, I'm told, encourages their claims to be a Muslim nation and to be governed by the Sharia, the whole Islamic law, end of quote. According to the British ambassador, the Pomaks appear to treat the Christians who lived amongst them with justice and toleration, although nearby Muslim villages were subjected to any kind of outrages, and they could see that from the mountains. In the meantime, the Russians had refrained from attacking them for some time, but on the other hand, the Ottoman government had taken no measures to restore its authority on those districts. For Layard, clearly the only source of authority was in the hands of Clair, who gradually organized, and I quote, a considerable disciplined force, an army of around 8,000 troops, composed of the Muslim inhabitants of the country, of fugitives from Bulgaria, and of soldiers who have disbanded on the retreat of Suleiman Pasha's army in the winter. This force may cause considerable trouble to the port. It may resist the return of the Turkish authorities, or if broken up, there is a fair chance of a large number of those who belong to it taking to brigands, which actually was anyway widespread in the region. I return to the quote. I have strongly advised the Grand Vizier to take measures to prevent the danger. The latter promised to send officers with a substantial force to restore order. I trust this means to remove Mr. Sinclair and his friends. It is by no means desirable that the English name should be mixed up with their proceedings. In July 1878, in the context of the Berlin Treaty, the representatives of the great powers appointed a commission to inquire into the condition of Muslims in the Rhodope Mountains. This commission comprised of 7 members, one from England, Austria-Hungary, France, Russia, Italy, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. On the 6th of August 1878, the commission met with the commander-in-chief of the national forces of the Rhodope, Sinclair. According to Sinclair, in January, Muslim refugees were cut off from the Russian army and thus made their way to mountainous Rhodope. After the armistice, they were induced to return home under promises that they would not get attacked, but they were pillaged and oppressed. The first resistance movement began then, at that time, by a certain Omer and Sam Kara Yusuf. The Bulgarians pretended that they were attacked, but the opposite happened. According to Sinclair, as a result of Russian and Bulgarian oppression and violence, there were more than 100,000 refugees in his area of jurisdiction, in the area of Tamrash. He also stated that the commission might have observed that no Bulgarian home within his area had been destroyed. The lines were established on the occasion of the armistice, but villagers were still fired upon by Russian-Hungarian troops. Shortly later, the commission ended its inquiry, but its final report was endorsed only by 4 of its members, the British, the French, the Italian, and the Ottoman. The Russian commissioner disagreed completely and retired from the proceedings, whilst the rest had reservations on whether the allegations against the Russians were based on solid proof. It's interesting that the Austrian commissioner actually had agreed with the findings, and at the time of the signing, he said that he could not sign the document, obviously having received orders from above. Additionally, they claimed that the final report implied the need of inquiry on the conduct of the Russian army, whilst the purpose of the commission was pure philanthropic. As a result, the report remained a dead letter. I will share with you here a map of the area that the commission visited. Maybe it's not very clear, but from what you see, it's the darkened areas, those that are shaded. So it's quite they travel quite a long distance. According to some sources, now, Sinclair had applied for the post of the Governor General of Eastern Rumelia when the latter was established by the Treaty of Berlin. Since his application was not considered, and seeing that his actions had raised concerns from various sources, he decided it was time to abandon his Pomak project. It is indicative that on the 2nd of December 1878, the British ambassador Layard writes to the Marquis of Salisbury about his meeting with the Grand Vizier Safed Pasha. I quote, "I further inquired from His Highness whether he did not anticipate some opposition on the part of the insurgents to the entry of Turkish troops into the districts which they held. I reminded His Highness that I had warned him more than once that Mr. St. Clair and other Europeans were organizing a disciplined force in Mount Rhodope and had encouraged the Muslim inhabitants to assume a kind of independence, which might cause considerable embarrassment to the port. His Highness said that it would no doubt be necessary to take precautions in sending the troops to the lines which they were to occupy, and the Minister of War was considering whether they should be forwarded by Kavala or some other place on the Aegean or through Adrianople. But he did not expect any serious resistance on the part of the insurgents to the presence of the Turkish regular force, especially as it would prevent them from being further molested by the Russians." End of quote. Hence, in late September, St. Clair and his companion George Paget prepared to leave for Constantinople. According to Paul, who was an officer at St. Clair's army, the Pomaks and other Muslim chiefs had been quarreling with each other as well as with St. Clair, and as a result, he and other Europeans wished to leave the area. St. Clair requested from the British mission in Constantinople to send a warship for him. The British declined as they believed that St. Clair would use the presence of a British ship in the area of Lagos, Porto Lagos, to show to the public that he had England's backing. In talks with Ottoman officials, it was mentioned that this was an opportunity to restore the port's authority in the area. Indeed, there was internal conflict between Muslim leaders of the region. As a result, one of them formed a band of his own, which was sizable and gained the support of the base of Drama, Xanthi, and Komotini, who disliked and resented the presence of foreign instigators and fighters in the area. Actually, St. Clair was chased by Muslim guerrillas on his way to Lagos, but was saved simply because he lost his way. He tried to gain the support of regular troops, but as accusations appeared against him, he was threatened with imprisonment. He finally ended up in Istanbul in December 1878 before leaving the country for good. And we must say here that a few years later, St. Clair died in Belgium. In spring 1879, now, the Russian army began withdrawing from the region, and the Bulgarian authorities gradually took over the administration. The area in question came under the jurisdiction of Plovdiv, Philippopolis, which initially had a Bulgarian prefect, but was soon replaced by the Turk Mehmet Bey. The fact that the administration was given to persons chosen by the Bulgarians and not to local Pomak notables, which was a common practice in the past, further estranged the latter, which in a meeting they held at Trigrad decided not to recognize the jurisdiction of Plovdiv. By the summer of 1879, a total of 17 Pomak villages had agreed to submit to the leadership of an old local notable coming from an old notable family of the region, Ahmed Agha from Tamrash or Tamrashliyata. Ahmed Agha, along with the other local notable Ahmed Agha Tamrashliyata, were instrumental in perpetuating the massacre of the Christian inhabitants of Perustica, Pestora, Brachigovo, and Batak, which we discussed earlier, during the events of the Bulgarian hordes in 1876. Because both of them have the same name, it is not clear who had instigated those events. It seems that Ahmed Agha of Tamrash was mainly accused, though it's quite probable that Ahmed Agha Tamrashliyata was responsible. Nevertheless, Ahmed Agha of Tamrash was a person that enjoyed the absolute respect and obedience of the Pomak population in the area of Rhodope and Tamrash, and he was considered to be a man of justice. Ahmed Agha organized a separate government with a number of portfolios distributed to local Pomak notables such as Haji Hassan Agha from Trigrad, Haji Mehmet from Beden, and Molay Ayub from Mughla. The statelet of Tamrash is referred to with different names in Balkan historiography. Among the most common are temporary Turkish state of Rhodope, or the insubordinate villages, or Tamraska Republika. Turkish bibliography in particular gives emphasis to names implying the existence of an actual republic. I will share some photos now with you. This is the map of the area of Tamrash and the villages of Tamrash, where this statelet was created. This is their flag. And we will also see some photographs of typical guerrillas, typical guerrilla fighters of the time, either chetes or komitadjis or klefts. All these pictures, according to the sources I found, are from Tamrash at the time. In 1881, 4 more villages from Tatar Pazarjik, which is a bit further to the north, joined the insurgency. The authorities of the new statelet collected their own taxes, which were significantly lower compared to the old Ottoman ones, probably 3 times lower, and dispatched an ambassador to Plovdiv, who also instructed to issue visas to those wishing to visit its mountainous territories. According to some sources, Ahmed Agha had contacted the Bulgarian authorities in Plovdiv in order to recognize him as the head of the whole Rhodope region. In exchange, the insubordinate villages would accept the authority of Eastern Rumelia. But since the latter declined to furnish him with this title, the unrest continued, giving the pretext to Turkey in parallel to have a role in the area and exercise pressure for its secession from Eastern Rumelia. However, the underlying anti-Bulgarian sentiments that fueled the rebellion soon became irrelevant following the recognition by the Ottoman Empire of the annexation of Eastern Rumelia by the Bulgarian principality in 1885. The final demarcation of the border between the two countries that followed in 1886 brought most Pomak villages of Tamrash and Kerjali under the Ottoman Empire, thus putting an end to the very reason that had led to the outbreak of the rebellion in 1878. And I will share 2 maps showing the demarcation. This is a British map prepared showing how lines were the border lines were drafted. And here it's a bit clearer because we can see the area of Eastern Rumelia and the 2 enclaves of Pomak resistance that were eventually given back to the Ottoman Empire. Following the return to the Ottoman Empire, the Pomaks of Tamrash continued to enjoy widespread autonomy, while some of their leaders were decorated by the Ottoman authorities. Nevertheless, this was a relatively short-lived autonomy. With the outbreak of the Balkan Wars in 1912-1913, the area of Tamrash fell under the control of the Bulgarian army, followed by the people of Pestara and Perustica, who longed for revenge for the events of 1876 and burned Tamrash to the ground. And we can see here in the pictures what has remained of Tamrash. Today it's abandoned, and at the time of the Balkan Wars, its inhabitants fled to the south. The picture on the right is an abandoned now cemetery, and the picture on the left is a defense position, a tower in the area of Tamrash. Getting to some concluding remarks, we have several contemporaneous accounts of those events, although there are several lacunas. One, we have wished that St. Clair had written his own memoirs. This would have been an interesting sequel to his book Residency in Bulgaria from the 1860s. Another interesting aspect, however, is how the persecution of the events has been formed by the outlook of the various interested parties. This goes both for contemporaneous rivaling groups and powers, as well as for the successor states of the Ottoman Empire. The difference in outlook leads to widely diverging interpretations. The French historian Bernard Laurie describes Ahmed Agha of Tamrash as the last derebe of the Rhodopes. In other words, Ahmed Agha represents the closure of an era and a reaction to the calamities brought on by the new national movements. Bulgarian and Turkish historiographies, on the other hand, seek to incorporate the events in a national narrative that addresses concern of a later period. They project later concerns back in time and thus impose an interpretive framework that is foreign to the historical context of the society in question. A case in point is the word republic in Turkish accounts. Mustafa Kemal's break with the Ottoman regime has given a special prestige to the word republic, and Turkish nationalists have thus taken a liking to the word republic when describing the Arab national or pseudo-national movements during the late Ottoman period. In this connection, the Pomak Republic is the first in line of several republics in Thrace, predating the establishment of the Turkish Republic by Kemal Atatürk. As an example, we can refer to the Gümülcine Republic of 1913 and the Hemetli, known as Organi, village republic in 1920, known as the Turkish Republic of Western Thrace. Another aspect of Turkish historiography is that it will downplay the role played by foreigners such as Clair and emphasize the contributions of Muslims who will all be referred to as Turks, reflecting the transformation of the meaning of the word brought on by the Kemalist revolution. In Bulgarian historiography, the influence of subsequent socio-political developments is also salient. The Pomaks under the label Bulgarian Muslims or Mohammedan Bulgarians are considered to be part of the Bulgarian nation, a lost brethren. A book published by the Bulgarian Academy of Science in 1958 presents Ahmed Agha as a feudal overlord that acts out of his concern to avoid punishment for his atrocities committed during the April uprising in 1876, and to keep his traditional position that allowed him to exploit the civil peasants. The terminology of the book is enhanced by the frequent use of the Balkan us. The corresponding term in Greek and Turkish is dithen or guya, respectively. Another interesting figure is Capitan Petko Voivoda. We mentioned before the name, who under Russian tutelage led bands of irregular Christians who fought the forces of St. Clair in the area. Petko Voivoda, who was from Simi, Dogan Hisar, in Evros, began his career as a traditional brigand, but became gradually involved in national struggles. He is somewhat of a transitory figure between the traditional brigands and the new breed of educated revolutionaries who would form the core of the interim Macedonian Revolutionary Organization after 1893. British reports from 1878 describe him simply as a bandit. In Bulgarian historiography, on the other hand, he leads the pantheon of Thracian revolutionaries. Eventually, his person embodied all the virtues one could wish for in a communist revolutionary of the socialist period. The Tamrash uprising took place in a very fluid environment. The problems of interpretation are surely influenced by the unevenness of the available sources. However, the processing of the events by nationalist historiographies has maybe played the greatest role in forming the subsequent perception of the events. Various sources and analysis tend to decorate the protagonists of the events with greater and wider motives and ideals that serve the biggest national idea, whilst it may well have been the case that those same motives were of a more humble local character that served a more modest agenda that focused on everyday survival through the storm of history. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Georgios, for that sort of intriguing story. The floor is now open to questions. I might kickstart things off with a few questions as they start to sort of roll in. You mentioned at one stage that St. Clair had around 8,000 troops under him. That's quite a logistical challenge. How did he manage to hold them together? I mean, the supplies required and so forth, and the logistics, and how did he keep things together?
I believe mainly locally, because in the north they had the Bulgarians, and in the south, again, it was a bit troublesome. It was a buffer zone, but they could not actually get easily towards the most southern plains towards the Aegean Sea. So I think it was purely locally. And all the sources seem to agree with that. They don't mention, going back and forth the region.
But there were many sort of, let's say, foreign, I don't know, not mercenaries, but there were many foreigners in his group as well.
Adventurers,
how were they maintained with regards to resources they required and so forth?
Especially during Yeah, that's it. Well, initially in the first stages actually of the Tamrash rebellion organized by Saint Clair, because actually we can divide the Tamrash rebellion in two parts, one under Saint Clair and the other one under Ahmed Agha. In the initial parts, sometimes they descended towards the southern villages and they plundered some of them. And this is when we mentioned that they instigated the reaction of the Russian army, who tried to forestall their movement southwards. So some part of the bill was paid through plundering for some time.
I've got a question here from Spiza Dimitriou. Thank you for that edifying lecture. How many people in the world identify as being Pomak today, and where they're located across the globe? So it's about the present-day Pomaks in Greece and Bulgaria and those in the diaspora. We have some type of numbers around that.
About the diaspora, I don't really know. I mean, there are some. I mean, there is a diaspora also from Western Thrace. There is a diaspora in Germany. Quite a lot of them work in Greek ships worldwide. I came across several personal stories whilst working in the region. In Greece, they number around, in Western Thrace, they number around 30 to 35,000. In Bulgarian Thrace, there are more, because actually the Muslim minority in Bulgaria is like 10% of the whole population. So they are more than 50,000. But I don't have accurate numbers for Bulgaria in that respect.
Another question of the modern day Pomaks. What's the current state of affairs? Have they mainly become urbanized, or they still live in sort of villages and still involved with agriculture? What's the current sort of state of affairs of the Pomaks in Greece or in Thrace?
Well, the majority still lives on the mountains, and mainly they are concentrated in the area of Xanthi. And a few villages in the area of Rhodope in Komotini, in the north of Komotini, but mainly in Xanthi. In Xanthi, we can say that they are maybe the majority of the Muslim minority there. But through the years, several have descended towards the lowlands, especially after by mid-90s, the area was a restricted military zone. Movement was restricted in the region at the time. Until 1994, 1996. After that, they were much freer to travel. But I mean, it's not that their villages have been abandoned. They are quite lively.
And I've read somewhere that their language has been sort of codified and it's also written in Greek script, or at one stage was written with the Greek alphabet. Is that correct? Or?
They're using the Bulgarian alphabet mainly. Okay. And I mean, it's a problem for them because at home they speak Pomak, their local idiom. At school they have to learn Turkish, and when they go to the city they have to speak in Greek, which causes a lot of problems to the young kids and the young students.
On the other hand, they're trilingual, so which is the benefits. We've got a question here from Georgios. Thank you for your detailed coverage of the topic. I was curious, you mentioned the Komitadzidis and showed photos. Were all Komitadzidis Pomaks?
The Komitadzidis in the photos, yes, they were from the Tamrash region. They were Pomak guerrillas, let's put it this way.
That's the one in the photos, but as a general term, not all, of course, not all Komitadzidis were Pomaks.
No, and usually the Komitadzi term is referred to the Bulgarians, from what we know in the Macedonian struggle.
Okay. Just waiting for... I've got a question here from John Katsoulis. Is the population officially recognized by any nation? I'm not quite sure what he means by that. So, yeah.
Well, the Greek state, for example, recognizes that there is only one minority, and that's a religious minority, the Muslims, which, however, is divided between Turkogenis of Turkish descent, Pomaks and Roma gypsies. So it's a bit of a gray area, actually.
Okay.
And the Pomaks themselves are divided. Some identify as Turks, some as Pomaks.
As a separate identity.
Yes, exactly.
You mentioned before that there were 2 other attempts at sort of insurrections or temporary republics. Can you just say a few words on those?
Yeah, in 1913, all of them had to do, just like the Tamrash case, all of them had to do with the change of events and status quo in the region. So when the Bulgarians tried to occupy the region in 1978, the local Muslims who did not want the Bulgarians and had bitter memories of them tried to create something independent. They did not want to be under the rule of the Bulgarians. The same happened in 1913. In 1913, we have the Balkan Wars. The region falls under the rule of the Bulgarians, although initially it was liberated by the Greek army. And the local notables, mainly Muslim, but with the collaboration of the Greeks, they organized this Gümülcina Republic, where they took arms and made a lot of pledges to the great powers in order not to be incorporated to the Bulgarian Thrace. In the 1920s, again, it's the same story. This time it's the Greeks having the upper hand in the region. And this time it is the Bulgarians and the Muslim Turks of the north of Komotini who work together in order to avert and turn the tide of the Greek occupation, as it happened eventually. So it's mainly an issue of local interests that try to influence things and the public opinion and the great powers.
When you had the Treaty of Lausanne and exchange of populations, the Muslims of Thrace were basically excluded from the exchange of populations. What were the main mitigating factors around that? I mean, what was the case for them to be excluded?
I think the main thing was that it had to do with the Greeks of Constantinople, because Greece did not want the Greeks of Constantinople to be included in the exchange.
You need the counterbalance.
Yes,
population.
exactly, and because the minority in Constantinople was quite urban, and it could be influential in political affairs. I think that the local political elite at the time, given the fact of the catastrophe and the outrage of the Greek public opinion, did not want another headache, having to incorporate a very dissatisfied and rich part of the diaspora of the time. So this was a counterbalance. Okay, we want the patriarchate there because it symbolizes something big. We want the minority there. What will we have in exchange? The Muslim minority in Thrace. That's why the 2 minorities that were exempted from the exchange at the time were of similar numerical strength.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for that. Okay, I don't see any further questions from the floor, so I think we might bring things to a close. Georgios, thank you very much for that presentation.
Thank you. It was a privilege.
Back one day in sort of future years. Even better on the ground here in Melbourne, where you can sort of come and visit the Greek Centre. Best of luck with your studies, with your research.
Thank you very much.
Thanks once again for accepting our invitation.
Best regards to your audience. Thank you very much.
And hope to see you all next week's seminar as well with Professor Georgios Anagnostou. And don't forget to book your tickets for the opening nights of the film festival.